I don't necessarily work with actors. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in working with people that already know a particular way of performing. I think, I'm interested in this idea that everyone already has a kind of built-in performance version of themselves. So I'm not interested in another layer of that. I'm actually interested in sort of using the videos where you kind of strip down or make that sort of artifice of their performance more visible. I'm interested in seeing the body move. I think those are really kind of beautiful moments, but particularly untrained bodies and the kinds of awkwardness that might involve. I feel like that's an interesting way of getting to a particular kind of vulnerability that I'm interested in all of my work. Vulnerability as a means to, I think, reimagine the self, reimagine the way that one performs the self, specifically in these very physical ways. A lot of the video kind of uses the figure of the cowboy, not as something that I'm trying to sort of reaffirm, let's say, but I like the fact that that figure is already so loaded with meaning. It's such a stand-in for so many ideas about masculinity, specifically white masculinity in this country. It's almost a representative of the way of the things that this country values in itself. The sort of muscular stoicism that, let's say, values individual liberty above and beyond all else. And I was interested in seeing how my performers could sort of reimagine this character, one that they are kind of excluded from portraying. Along with that, I borrowed a lot of gestures from bull riding, looking at how they use their body in a way that perhaps might not be thought of as a particularly sensuous or even aesthetic activity. It's so much more about endurance and overcoming the bull and things like that. And I wanted to kind of strip away those qualities and reveal something else. And so a lot of the abstract movements in the video are taken directly from bull riding, but slowed down in order to, again, highlight the more aesthetic qualities about those movements that are probably repressed and certainly de-emphasized over other qualities. Thinking about the cowboy as a kind of plastic figure, one that occupies a large space, I think, in the popular imagination. Certainly in advertising, with something like the Marlboro Man, which in itself was an invention that it was designed to exploit a certain kind of idea of masculinity, and so I feel like I'm just kind of appropriating that figure again, but to different ends. For this project, I came across this bit of history about the Chinese railroad workers, particularly the strike that they organized in, I believe it was 1857 or 1856, I forget the exact date. But anyway, it was a strike that was in response to the sort of arduous working conditions that they were put under, and the fact that they were not being paid as well as their non-Chinese counterparts. Somehow they were able to organize a strike across the entire railroad line, which was many, many miles. I don't know the exact figure, but it stretched along the entire length of the construction at the time. Somehow they were able to coordinate this in a way that escaped the attention of the railroad company itself. And they were able to organize themselves and basically withhold their labor, with their demands being that they wanted shorter working days, better working conditions, and pay that was comparable to their non-Chinese counterparts. So these are, things that I think we all recognize even today. And so it was interesting for me when I discovered this, that not only did this happen, but yet somehow they were able to do this with basically very primitive means. And it's still not clear to this day like how they did that. There's no sort of extant written proof, let's say, of how they were able to communicate this across such a long distance. And amongst people that really did not have that much in common, right? Like some people would take it for granted that these, just because they came from the same country, that they were somehow all on the same page, or were all necessarily looking out for each other's interests. And that's not necessarily the case. These people came from different villages with different goals in mind, and they just sort of ended up working in the same place. But I thought that was really important, this idea that these men who had no previous sort of relationship with each other somehow realized that by working together, by banding together, they could exert some sort of leverage, or perhaps even create like a new identity for themselves, one that would not have existed were they back in their home country. And that, for me, I felt, really was analogous to this overall idea of Asian American identity, this sort of thing that really is not tied to any specific locale or culture or set of cultural practices, but yet in this country, for better or worse, they get sort of lumped together into this one sort of slightly homogenous group, again, for better or worse. So I thought that within that strike perhaps laid the seeds for this sort of kind of cross-cultural or pan-Asian kind of identity, which, I'm not saying that these workers in any way identified as Asian American or anything like that. They certainly did not feel like they were a part of this country at all, but yet I think that like in some small way, the roots for something, or the foundations for something, for an identity that would only come, 100, 150 years later, perhaps started with an event like this. They started withholding provisions, stopped feeding them essentially. They were able to convince the people that were supplying the provisions to stop delivering them food. And so after a week, they were essentially starved back into working. In the short term, it was a loss, but eventually they did get an increase in wages. And I think that, the way the historians have written about it is that this event, even though it didn't achieve any immediate goals, perhaps created a sense of identity or a sense of solidarity between them that did not exist before. Moving forward, these men perhaps were a labor force that could not be taken for granted in the same way. Certainly not in the eyes of the railroad company that they were working for. And so I think that it had perhaps more long-term ramifications, despite the fact that they were not able to meet their demands, or that their demands were not met.